Hello, and welcome to HMR 1, Week 10, Lecture 2, where we look at the intersection of climate justice and human rights. Now, over the last, since Thanksgiving, we've been looking at the role of the, the evolution of international institutions and uh, movements and organizations that are focused on righting human wrongs by embracing the human rights idea. And over the last couple of weeks, we've looked specifically at the elaboration of the International Bill of Human Rights and its constituent elements, from the Universal Declaration to the Genocide Convention, the efforts on behalf of children and women, and also refugees. We've been thinking about refugees. And one of the key questions going forward in terms of climate and climate change is the question of climate refugees. Can someone be a forced migrant and considered a refugee if what they're being forced to leave, what's pushing them, is a changing climate? So we'll put that question up on the board, metaphorically, and we'll come back to it. So, what are some of the basic facts about climate and climate change? First, and there was terrible news. There's both some terrible news every day and often some good news on the climate front every once in a while. The good news is that if, for example, the United States rejoins the Paris Accords, which President-elect Biden has said he will do upon taking office, that many of the targets that were set, climate targets that were set by the Paris Climate Accord, if the United States abides by them, will be able to rein in temperature change, keep temperature change from climbing much over 2 degrees by the end of this century. Now, unfortunately, this is an enormous planetary system, and it's unclear if that will be enough. Then, of course, we have the distressing news that the Arctic sea ice is not coming back in significant enough amounts to ensure a year-round ice pack, which will have implications for polar communities and indigenous communities around the top of the world. So climate change is very much with us. It's different from weather, of course, but even here in California, we've been having shorter and shorter intervals between our periods of drought and normal. Our normals are not so normal, and we've seen the impact of fires, in particular, on our lives and the lives of other Californians. But there's one simple fact about climate change that I want to keep in mind as we proceed with today's lecture. And that is a simple fact that climate change will not affect all of humanity equally. That there will be some communities that will have a terrible experience with climate change, even to the point of the extinction of their societies. And there are others who will see climate change as a terrible inconvenience, but still be able to prosper and live their lives in relative comfort and ease through technology, wealth, mitigation efforts, and so on. And so that's a real tension in human rights, and why I think less in terms of climate change and think in terms of the demands of climate justice. This last spring, in fact, I added a course, an overload, right, where I gathered some of the best and brightest of our human rights undergrads for what I call the climate change seminar, the climate justice seminar, where we began to imagine what a course or courses around human rights and climate change might look like. And I have several colleagues on campus who are already doing something along these lines. So if this is something that interests you, I encourage you to pursue this line of research, because this is an issue and problem confronting all of us. And it's not just about technology. It's not just about shifting away from fossil fuels. It's keeping our eyes on the realities of the unequal and inequitable outcome of climate change and how we collectively are responsible for to minimize the impacts on a much larger scale. So, climate change is going to change us as a people, as a species. How it changes us will be up to us. So I want to look, and we looked in the opening at two communities and the question of their climate change. The first are the people of Kivalina, Alaska. Kivalina, Alaska. And they are the first time the New York Times used the phrase climate refugees was in an article about them from a few years ago. Now, what's happening? What's happening there in Kivalina? So Kivalina is on a peninsula that goes out into the Bering Sea. They need a good snowfall to create a kind of ice pack berm that keeps the sea and the winter storms from destroying their communities. But what you also heard is that the quality of the ice has grown so poor over the last generation that the traditional, one of their traditional ways of life and ways of feeding themselves in their community, and also sort of conceptualizing their relationship to the natural world, which was harvesting and hunting whales as they pass along the Bering Sea, has become nearly impossible. That the whalers do not want to go out on the ice because they're worried that, not just that they won't get a whale, but that they won't come back at all. And so the land that they're on is eroding. It's retreating, if you will, from the sea. And in that retreat, it's becoming more difficult for them to, keep their houses together and also to keep their village together. And so what's proposed for them is that they move back. Right? It's called managed retreat. And this is a process that you can see happening all over the United States, in fact, where sort of future-looking real estate brokers are buying up land further in from the sea. I noticed this at the marina where I keep my boat. There's been every couple of years they're raising the level of the seawall around where our boats are moored, and that you're seeing efforts to increase dunes and other natural and artificial features to keep the sea from coming in. Right? But managed retreat is one of these other things where you say, okay, we're just not going to be able to keep the sea back, so we're going to have to move inland. And for the Kivalina, this is either good or bad, and it's probably a combination of both. Alaska is big. Alaska is enormous. Right? It's inconceivably enormous. Right? And there's so much of Alaska doesn't have human habitation or very limited human habitation that it's perfectly reasonable to imagine that with proper consultation and support, the Kivalinese, the Inupiaq people of Kivalina, could be moved inland. But that doesn't address all the issues they're confronting, does it? And you could hear in the discussion of their mayor, you could hear in his language a real concern about the relationship between their lives on the very shore of the sea and their access to the wealth of the sea and their continued distinct identity as a people, and their fear that this being forced to move inland is in fact a way for them to face forced assimilation. In other words, to lose their identity. So the other people that we looked at in the video before are the people of Kiribati. Now, Kiribati is very famous in the climate justice discussion because of this very charismatic former president of this tiny little island. I mean, Kiribati is, it's not anywhere even close to the size of Yolo County. It is tiny, right? It's tiny. And much of it are atolls. So what's happening in Kiribati? So Kiribati is very low-lying. It's an island that's made of sort of dead coral, sand. I'm not even sure there's anything volcanic about it. It just sort of it sits in a shallow part of the South Pacific, and it's protected by this coral reef around it. And as the sea level changes, but also as the pH of the sea changes, the coral is beginning to be destroyed, and as waves hit it, instead of deflecting the waves back out to sea, the waves make their way over the coral and onto land. So this is washing away people's homes, but also getting into their aquifer. It's salinating, it's bringing salt into their drinking water. And so they're thinking they're adopting these strategies, right? They're saying, look, if we're going to be underwater, we're just going to disappear. We can't we need to have some choice, some agency in how we move from here to somewhere else. And so there are the job training programs and so on that seem very modest, right? And then there's also this other idea to purchase land elsewhere to create a kind of, I don't want to, it's a kind of state within a state, which in that case also might displace another group of previously displaced people, former slaves, descendants of slaves from freed slaves from the Solomon Islands. So neither of these strike me as particularly welcomed or humane options, but options that are presented by the realities, but also by, to some extent, a failure of larger imagination. So in the case of Kiribati, well, what I want to ask is, from your understanding of what makes a refugee, are either of these communities refugee communities? Are they refugees? And since I can't hear your answer, I'm going to answer for you. So to some extent, the Refugee Convention, which turns on this issue of fear of persecution, doesn't seem to work here. And one of the ideas that I brought up when I was talking about the Refugee Convention last week, which is some of its limitations, how it hasn't really changed with the time. And so you have in the case of the Kivalinans especially, much more of a situation that applies to what we call internally displaced people. Internally displaced people. Now, the key difference though is if the people of Kivalina move back 5 miles, back up into Alaska, they don't lose the sovereignty which gave the sovereign state within which they have citizenship. They are citizens of the United States. And they're just moving from one part of the United States to another part of the United States. The United States isn't going anywhere. And so they stay Alaskans and they stay citizens of the United States. Now, what happens in Kiribati? What happens if all, and this is not an if, but frankly when, Kiribati disappears? What happens when Kiribati totally disappears beneath the waves? And everyone on that island has to leave, and they have to go somewhere else. What happens to their basic rights as citizens? Will they have them? Is there a way for people to have citizenship in a state that is uninhabitable, which is underwater entirely? And so that begins to feel to me closer to something where the underlying principle of what makes someone a refugee, that especially the ideas that predate the 1951 convention about being stateless, about being denationalized. In this case, the world's misbehavior in terms of climate has denationalized the people of Kiribati. They no longer have a nation within which to be Kiribati. So they could conceivably be seen as climate refugees, although I think there needs to be the elaboration of a new way to think about them. So could they have dual citizenship? Is there, but these things are there. But the reality is that if there are people that are kind of dispersed throughout the South Pacific, or emigrate to the United States, or find their way to working as in luxury hotels in the Great Barrier Reef, how do they maintain their integrity as a people, or do they just disappear? And is that something that we are willing to tolerate collectively? So climate change will create these impacts on communities like Kiribati, on communities like Kivalina. It's going to create disruptions and dislocations, especially in areas that will become too hot to live. And again, in these two cases, these are not affecting wealthy people. They're affecting indigenous people disproportionately, poor people disproportionately, people of color and those living in developing states disproportionately. So one idea to come out of the experience of, in particular, Kiribati, is beginning to imagine a way forward in terms of linking the needs of possible climate refugees with existing human rights ideas. And one is just, the first idea is to just acknowledge something that hasn't been done in international treaties or agreements thus far, is that climate displacement happens. Right? There's no international document sort of recognizing that this is an issue. Right? The second would be to advocate for kind of regional solutions to this problem. I mean, you can sort of see hints of that, right? Where the Kiribati are looking primarily to develop states like New Zealand and Australia for economic opportunity. What happens if they could manage that relationship? It might go towards helping to preserve elements of Kiribati sovereignty or Kiribati identity in doing so. But also, and this is one of the reasons why I started the climate justice seminar, was that I was seeing in the approach to discussions about climate change that human rights and migration were being left out. They may be seen as after effects, but not, this is critical, not in the recipe for solution. In other words, all the solutions that were being discussed on the international level, academic level in a way, were solutions addressing the kinds of, that sought to address the change itself. Right? Let me say this a little bit more clearly. That were, for example, lowering emissions of certain kinds of chemicals, keeping more carbon fuels in the ground, things that might have a deeper impact on people in the north, or wealthier people, but not a discussion of integrating into that solution how to help certain communities in need. So, where are human rights in climate change discussions? And so I went to the Paris Peace Accord, different era, the Paris Climate Accords, which the United States has just withdrawn from, and will rejoin in just a few weeks. And I just did a search for the word human rights, and the words occur once in the entire 77-plus page document. And they occur in a very almost nonsensical preambulatory sentence, one that includes sort of, we have to respect people's rights, the rights of indigenous people, health, migrants, children. In other words, that we're going to, 90% of this is about industry and limiting emissions. And then we also have to, think about, if we can, about the vulnerable, about those whose rights are being violated. And this gets to a final point that I want to make. And that's this question of responsibility for climate change and this other human right, the human right to development. The West China, Europe, America. These places became rich and are continuing to be rich, in part through the exploitation of fossil fuels, right? The use of coal and oil and gas helped propel their industrialization, their ability to exert colonial control over the entire world, something we looked at in the previous section. In other words, that there was a link between the creation of the conditions under which climate change is taking place and the wealth of some parts of the world and the exploitation of other parts of the world. There's a relationship. And so one of the things that has to come out, one of the critical elements of confronting climate change has to do with reducing greenhouse emissions and so on, including in a way that might limit the right to development of people around the world. So how do you balance that is the other question. In addition to how do we help people who are going to be displaced by climate change, how do we make sure that those countries who are seeking to develop can do so in a way that does not contribute more to climate change, but also fulfills their right to development. And this is where Article 29 of the UDHR always comes to my mind. And that's the article, the 29th article of the UDHR is about responsibilities. It's about duty. And so the question is, those of us who exist in a part of the world where our wealth, our comfort, everything that we have has in part been built on the actions of our ancestors that have created the problems of this world and that we are still part of, what is our responsibility to people in other parts of the world that we're asking to forego access to those same things? What is our responsibility? And that's a question you're going to have to answer. My kids are going to have to answer. But the reality is there must be an answer. All right, back to class.